Some men kill for thrill, others for control. But these 5 American serial killers didn't need reasons anyone could understand. Between 1970 and 1995, they hunted without mercy, random victims, chosen not for love or betrayal, but for proximity, weakness, or nothing at all. They weren't monsters in basements. They were gas station clerks, neighbors, mechanics, men who smiled while planning another death. Their killings weren't crimes of passion, they were acts of design. Before we dive into it, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And don't forget to subscribe, because these men were never monsters in the dark. They were monsters in plain sight. Donnie Hurst worked nights at a highway rest stop just outside of Sandpoint, Idaho in the late 1970s. On paper, he was a mild-mannered maintenance man who kept to himself and clocked in without fail, rain or snow. But what no one saw was the routine he built behind that quiet face, a pattern disguised as normalcy. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he arrived an hour early, not to work, but to scout. He kept a notebook in his glove compartment where he logged license plate numbers, travel patterns, and the makes of cars parked for long stretches. He didn't chase drifters. He didn't target women with family. Donnie watched for the isolated, women driving alone across state lines, often during off hours, with no company and no apparent plan to check in with anyone. He chose his first victim on a night the temperature dropped to 28 degrees and the diner lights across the highway flickered out from a brief power surge. Her name was Kelly Reeves, 29, traveling from Spokane to Helena after a job interview. She had coffee at the vending machine and sat in her car for over 20 minutes. Donnie took a photo of her license plate with a disposable camera, walked calmly back into the staff utility closet, and waited. After her third trip inside to use the bathroom, he made his move. He had previously rigged the back women's stall, placing a wedge behind the door so it could not open from the inside once shut. He knew the lock didn't work, and he knew once she was inside, she'd push it closed without noticing the obstruction. When she did, and found herself trapped, he moved silently. He used a duplicate staff key, unlocked the front, and entered the tiled corridor with a pair of thick rubber gloves and a 16-inch sharpened tire iron with the handle sawed down and wrapped in leather. She never screamed, not once. The first hit cracked her skull clean above the left temple. The second shattered her clavicle. He worked quickly, wiping the tiles before blood could spread far. Then came the part he obsessed over: containment. He had parked an old green maintenance van, unregistered and with a fake plate, behind the building where cameras didn't reach. He wrapped her body in a waterproof tool tarp and stored it beneath a panel he had hollowed out weeks before. The cleaning supplies on top remained undisturbed. He finished his shift, drank coffee, smiled at a trucker, clocked out, and drove the body across the state line into a ravine he had marked during fishing trips as a teen. He tied her ankles to a 42-pound engine block with copper wire and pushed it off a rock shelf. The splash was barely audible beneath the fog. Donnie returned the next day, as usual, and no one noticed a thing. Over the next 8 months, he repeated the process with horrifying precision. Always women traveling solo, always at rest stops between 2 and 5 a.m. His fake van was moved and repainted after each killing. He purchased gloves in bulk. He never used the same weapon twice, sometimes a sawed-off wrench, sometimes a weighted crowbar, once even a repurposed fire extinguisher used to suffocate before impact. He buried his tools in shallow gravel pits across Idaho and Montana. But what gave him away, eventually, wasn't a mistake in killing. It was how he watched. A state trooper reviewing camera footage for an unrelated vandalism report caught Donnie's figure appearing too often near the same rest stop corridor, even on nights he wasn't scheduled. A task force cross-checked shift logs, and Donnie's name repeated too frequently with locations tied to missing persons. His notebook, carelessly left in the glove compartment during a routine traffic stop, contained not only license plates but notes about ideal windows, vehicle descriptions, and a chilling phrase, "Don't get cocky, Tuesday is blood." That line triggered a search warrant. Hidden beneath the insulation in his crawl space were locks of hair, earrings, and one driver's license with blood smeared along the edges. He didn't run when they came. He was sitting at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper. When asked how many, he only said, "They were passing through." Donnie Hurst's arrest sent shockwaves through the quiet regions of northern Idaho. The idea that a calm, soft-spoken man who cleaned toilets and stocked paper towels could be responsible for such brutal surgical killings felt surreal. But the evidence was suffocating. His home, when searched thoroughly, was not just a residence. It was a system. In his basement, behind a false wall of old insulation and pegboards, investigators found a second room. The door had no handle, only a notch on the inside. Inside, the air was heavy with dampness and chemical fumes. The floor was lined with thick plastic tarp. On a table were rows of labeled Ziploc bags containing women's hair, lipstick tubes, and cracked fingernails. Beneath a lifted tile in the corner were 3 burner phones, all of which had been used to access motel Wi-Fi on the nights of multiple disappearances. Never from his own home, never from his real name. But most damning of all was what he called the ledger. A yellowed spiral notebook sat neatly inside a plastic bin marked "Winter Tools." Its pages were handwritten in a meticulous scrawl, numbering 12 entries. Each one included initials, vehicle type, location, and a cold phrase like "broke easy" or "took 2 hits." On page 13, the next victim was marked TR, red Saturn, gas cap rusted, traveler, next Thurs. That woman, a 25-year-old named Tamara Ross, had not yet gone missing. That line was the only thing that saved her. She later told reporters she'd pulled into the rest stop just once, 3 days before his arrest. She remembered seeing a green maintenance van, but no one inside. Donnie had already begun planning. But the arrest disrupted everything. What unfolded next was a trial so unnerving, it made national headlines for the sheer absence of emotion. Donnie pleaded not guilty. He hired a private attorney with money from a long-forgotten inheritance and sat calmly through proceedings. Prosecutors were forced to build their case primarily on circumstantial links, as Donnie never confessed, not even to one. The hair samples were matched to 3 missing women, but the lack of bodies made homicide charges difficult to secure. Still, the tire iron recovered from one of Donnie's storage units contained a partial blood trace that, through mitochondrial DNA, connected to Kelly Reeves's family line. That, combined with GPS pings and the disturbing ledger, gave the jury enough to convict. He was found guilty on 3 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. But the body count is believed to be far higher. A map recovered from his garage had 17 X's marked across 3 states, each tied to rest stops, abandoned turnouts, or remote fishing trails. Forensic teams returned to those areas for months, digging shallow pits and draining creeks, but many locations had changed. Some were flooded, some overgrown. Only one more body, that of 31-year-old Diane Krause, was recovered in a collapsed culvert beneath a bridge, her purse still intact with a rusted Idaho license plate inside. To this day, Donnie refuses interviews. His cell is sparse with nothing on the walls. Prison staff say he never speaks unless spoken to and never mentions the past. One guard claims to have found a napkin in his tray with the phrase, "Tuesday is blood," scratched into the corner again. Whether it was a sick signature or a psychological tic, no one knows. But for a man who was nearly invisible in life, no family visits, no prior arrests, no red flags, Donnie Hurst left behind a trail of silence that still haunts every rest stop he once walked through. Some killers hide behind charm, others behind jobs that take them everywhere and answer to no one. But the next man didn't need charm or travel. just an open window, a quiet breath, and a sharp blade. Because for 7 years, no one even knew he was real. Thomas Vale didn't live off charm or speed or brute force. He lived off patterns, predictable habits, forgotten windows. For nearly 6 years, he studied the spaces people ignored. Side gates never locked, basement vents cracked open for airflow, second-story windows left ajar in the summer heat. He lived alone in a decaying 2-bedroom house outside Milwaukee, with newspapers stacked in windows and deadbolts on every door. His job at the post office gave him access to hundreds of addresses, daily walking routes through neighborhoods, and the illusion of friendliness. But Thomas didn't smile. He observed. He memorized which homes had dogs, who left their porch lights on, whose curtains closed after 9 p.m. He kept small notebooks, one for each block, with handwritten symbols only he understood. He wasn't after a certain look or type. He wanted routine. Women who lived alone, homes with predictable quiet zones, places with long shadows between streetlights. He watched for months before deciding. Sometimes he'd follow one woman for weeks, pretending to fumble with mailboxes across the street while studying her exit and return times. He'd mark her habits, then he'd vanish for days, leaving her block cold. That was when he planned. He carried no phone, no car, just a backpack with gloves, a glass cutter, 2 folded plastic drop sheets, and a carbon steel 6-inch blade with no manufacturer's stamp. His break-ins happened between 2 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., late enough for deep sleep, early enough for neighbors to still blame raccoons for noise. He entered from the second floor whenever possible, climbing drain pipes or carports in socks for silence. Once inside, he didn't search. He stood. He watched, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes longer. He learned breathing rhythms, listened for sleep groans, waited for the exact moment a victim rolled onto her side, spine exposed, throat relaxed, unaware. He moved with purpose, never rushing. He'd press one gloved hand against the side of her face, push down hard, and with the other, draw the blade across the neck from under the jaw to the opposite ear in a practiced arc, severing major arteries in one pull. No scream, no blood spray, just a final gasp. He never killed in the same county twice. He never took trophies. But he did clean. He folded bodies into fetal position, wrapped them in the plastic sheets he brought, wiped every touched surface, and exited the way he came, out the second story, dropping onto grass, then gone. The bodies he left behind weren't always found right away. One was discovered only because her landlord came to fix a leak. Another wasn't discovered for 11 days. Police initially suspected suicide in 2 cases. Others were labeled home invasions gone wrong. Nothing tied them together. No common weapon, no vehicle seen, no DNA. Even the blade type was generic. But one detective started noticing oddities. Windows cut in the same corner, lights unscrewed in upstairs hallways, thermostat dials always turned low. Still, no suspect, no name. Until the night Thomas picked a home that wasn't empty. A guest had stayed over, her sister, and woke to footsteps. She saw only a glimpse, a man in black backing out the window. She screamed. Neighbors called 911. Police found fresh footprints outside leading through wet soil, and behind the house, wedged into a drain pipe, was a fragment of dark cotton fabric with a corner of a postal barcode tag barely attached. From that tag, they traced it back to a misprinted batch of postal uniform jackets. 10 were issued. One was signed out by a man who hadn't shown up for work in 3 weeks, Thomas Vale. But when police arrived at his house, it was empty. No furniture, no notes, not even fingerprints. Just the smell of bleach and the sound of an attic fan still spinning. And beneath the floorboards, they found the notebooks, 38 of them, each filled with block diagrams, household symbols, strange marks. and one had a name scribbled on the last page, his next target. She was found alive, unharmed. But she'd been watched for months and had no idea. Thomas Vale was never found. Some believe he died in the woods. Others say he took a new name, moved to a new state, and kept studying windows. Only one thing was certain. His kills weren't about rage or obsession. They were about control, quiet, deliberate control. Thomas Vale's trail wasn't uncovered through blood or mistakes. It was through rhythm. After the narrow escape in Shorewood, the woman's sister gave Milwaukee detectives the first and only eyewitness glimpse. A man in black, silent, retreating through the window. It wasn't enough to identify him, but it was enough to shift the pattern. An FBI profiler joined the case and compiled all unsolved break-in homicides from the past 6 years with similar characteristics. No forced entry on ground level, no sexual assault, little to no property theft, and consistent wounds to the throat or neck. That list included 17 cases across 4 counties. Local departments hadn't seen the link. Different jurisdictions, different reporting systems. But Vale had crossed state lines more than once. Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana. Each murder was spaced months apart, and that irregular timing threw off early attempts at connection. Still, one detective noticed a strange similarity in nearly every scene, a lack of heating. Even in winter, thermostats had been turned down. A forensic technician proposed a theory. The killer didn't want his sweat or scent to remain in warm air. In colder air, he'd shed less. That level of calculation narrowed the list of suspects from impulsive attackers to something more controlled. Meanwhile, the fabric scrap stuck in the drain pipe, initially considered insignificant, was traced to a uniform batch distributed in 1984 to regional USPS workers. Among them was Thomas Vale, a quiet carrier who had worked 3 routes in 3 years before abruptly transferring branches. A single call to human resources revealed something chilling. Thomas had been on medical leave for nearly 2 months, citing anxiety, yet surveillance from a nearby store placed someone matching his build and clothing on a late-night hardware run just a week prior to the last attack. Warrants were filed, and when police entered his home, they found more than silence. The walls were bare and all furniture stripped, but behind the wallpaper in the back bedroom, officers discovered thin paper sheets, floor plans, not drawings, actual blueprint scans of homes, printed and glued to the wall. Some were labeled with dates. A few had red X's over the bedrooms. One had a large black circle. It matched the address of a woman who'd been murdered 3 years ago, a case once blamed on a disgruntled ex-boyfriend. Suddenly, that case reopened. So did the others. Authorities now had evidence connecting at least 11 confirmed kills, and likely more. But the problem was, they still didn't have Thomas. His vehicle had been found abandoned at a park-and-ride station 22 miles away. Inside were rubber gloves, shoe covers, a burner phone with no contacts, and a laminated map of 5 Midwestern states with small circles inked in red. His name had never appeared in prior criminal databases. His fingerprints were not in any national registry. He had no credit cards, no online presence. And the last person to remember seeing him, a cashier at a gas station, said he looked like a man running from nothing. Calm, polite, paid in cash. There were no known relatives, no close friends. Even neighbors barely remembered him, describing him as quiet, maybe postal. But a breakthrough came when a retired delivery supervisor recognized the name on the FBI bulletin. He remembered Vale once requesting a transfer to a rural post office in Michigan, a place surrounded by forest and remote cabins. Authorities swarmed the area. They searched cabins, hiking trails, fishing shacks, and old delivery stations. In one abandoned cabin, they found a bedroll, a tin kettle, and a backpack buried under floorboards. Inside were the final pieces of Vale's mind. A Polaroid photo of each victim's house, taken from across the street, always during golden hour, always at a distance. None of them showed the victim. Just their home, perfectly framed, like a hunter admiring his blind. Under the photos were more notebooks, but these were blank. Just dates, locations, and addresses never acted on. One was labeled 2025. Authorities never found his body. No fingerprints, no trail, no remains. But one thing investigators agreed on: the way he moved, the way he studied, the way he left behind no sound. Thomas Vale wasn't killing to satisfy an urge. He was perfecting something, practicing it. The bodies were part of a larger ritual, a controlled test of how invisible a man can be in plain sight. And in that cabin, under a loose tile, they found one last thing: a note typed on a single piece of paper. It read, "You noticed. Took you long enough. But not all predators hide in shadows. Some sit across from you, smiling kindly, pretending to help. They speak in soft voices, ask the right questions, and tell you you're healing, even as they prepare your end." Carter Maddox didn't stalk strangers in alleys. He welcomed them into his office. Carter Maddox didn't look like someone who could make people disappear. Clean-shaven, soft-spoken, educated. The kind of man who would hand you tissues during a breakdown and tell you it's okay to cry. He was a licensed therapist operating out of a discreet home office in a quiet Seattle suburb during the late 1980s. His patient list was private, his reviews spotless, and his demeanor disarming. But Carter didn't just listen, he studied, especially the women who came in bruised by betrayal, insecure from past lovers, or unsure of who they were. He never hit on them, never crossed lines, not until they were already standing in the palm of his hand. One of them was Nicole Vega, a 29-year-old real estate broker who had just ended an abusive engagement. She came in guarded, skeptical of therapy, but Carter wore her down through silent nods, carefully timed empathy, and deliberate, quiet pauses that made her feel heard. Over 6 sessions, he mirrored her pain back to her, framed it like a puzzle he could help solve. And when she finally cracked and cried in his office, he handed her not tissues, but an invitation. A quiet retreat, a wellness method he'd developed on his own time, for patients who can't heal in 50-minute windows. She was hesitant, but he framed it like exposure therapy, a controlled challenge. Nicole said yes. He took her to a house that didn't exist on paper, a cabin 2 hours east, tucked into private forest land owned by a friend who owed him favors. The air was dry, the cell signal dead, and the space sterile. Nicole asked where the wellness materials were. Carter told her this step was about silence, resetting the nervous system before trauma processing. She believed him. That night, he offered herbal tea. Nothing that would knock her out. Carter didn't need shortcuts. He was methodical. He waited until 2:08 a.m., long after she'd fallen into the deep cycles of natural sleep. The cabin had no locks inside, no metal sounds, no creaky floorboards, just soft padding and a plastic bag. He'd done this before. The bag was industrial grade, opaque, with a pre-cut strip of duct tape ready. He moved silently, knelt by the bed, and placed it over her face in a single practiced motion. One hand pinned her arms, the other tightened the seal. No panic, no rage, just a soundless, steady hold. Her legs kicked once, then stopped. Carter didn't flinch. He timed it. Waited 4 minutes to be sure, then released. Nicole's body was still warm. He folded her hands, closed her eyes, and began step 2. He never left a scene behind. Her phone was already in airplane mode, wrapped in foil, then crushed and burned in a steel drum behind the cabin. Her purse, emptied, ID stripped, everything melted. The body went into a sealed contractor-grade duffel. He didn't bury it. Carter believed in water. He had mapped a spot 3 months earlier, a drop point along a deep tributary that fed into the Wenatchee River with sharp enough current to drag anything south. He drove there at 4:12 a.m., headlights off until the last turn. Nicole's body was dropped at the deepest bend, held down briefly by rebar weights, then left to vanish. He returned to the cabin, stripped the sheets, burned all linens, sprayed his usual bleach and alcohol solution. By 7 a.m., the cabin was empty. No blood, no prints, no tire tracks. Carter drove back to the city and attended a scheduled session by noon, shaved, dressed, and unreadable. When Nicole's friends raised concerns, he told police she'd canceled her last appointment and mentioned needing to get away. Her car was never found. Her last phone ping led nowhere, and Carter Maddox, once again, vanished from suspicion without leaving even a fingerprint behind. Carter didn't see himself as a killer. He saw himself as a calibrator, removing emotional chaos from people who didn't know they were infected with it. Nicole Vega had been the 7th, and she wouldn't be the last. The pattern always began the same way: identify vulnerability, construct trust, and introduce the idea of deep healing that required full surrender. Over time, Carter began selecting patients not just for emotional fragility, but for how easily they could vanish. No siblings nearby, no healthy parental relationship, no routine friend group that would raise alarm within 24 hours. His next patient was Clara Jennings, a 33-year-old interior designer with a string of depressive episodes and one out-of-state brother she hadn't spoken to in years. She came into his practice with heavy mascara and trembling fingers, ashamed of her dependency on emotionally distant men. Carter treated her with silence, nods, and the occasional phrase like, "Maybe it's not your fault. Maybe it's how they were trained to see you." He let her talk, let her spiral, and by session 4, she was describing dreams where she floated above herself, lost, weightless. That's when he offered his off-the-books therapy model again. She agreed. This time, he changed locations. A different cabin he hadn't used since 1986, smaller and even more remote, one he knew hadn't been visited in over a decade. Clara rode with him willingly, eyes bright from the thought of being saved by a man who seemed to finally understand her. Carter packed the same tea blend, the same plastic bag, the same soft gloves and timer. But this time, the disposal changed. Carter had started reading forensic journals. He'd noticed how technology was improving, how even riverbeds weren't safe forever. So he adapted. Clara's body was processed differently. He dismembered her in a clinical fashion, not violently, but with what he called separation. He wrapped each section in triple-sealed vacuum pouches, the kind used in industrial kitchens. They were labeled with fake dates and frozen like food supply. For 3 weeks, he kept the bags in a deep freezer located in a detached garage he had access to through an old landlord's forgotten property. When the time came, he booked a weekend in eastern Oregon, posing as a hunter. The bags were buried separately across 3 hiking zones under freshly planted native shrubs. He took photos of each site, not to keep as trophies, but to remind himself how well it had been done. Clara's disappearance sparked more concern than Nicole's. An ex-boyfriend began asking questions, and her phone's last location was too vague to be useful. Police visited Carter's office. He remained calm. He handed over Clara's appointment log. He even expressed concern. The officer left with a nod and a flyer. But things weren't as tight anymore. Technology was creeping closer. Carter knew he had to change again. And so, for a while, he stopped seeing patients altogether. But predators don't pause forever. His compulsion wasn't just about removal. It was about control, rebuilding silence from chaos. That need returned when he saw Melissa Tansey in a grocery store, crying in the wine aisle, trying to call someone who wouldn't pick up. She wasn't his patient. She wasn't connected to his practice. But that was the appeal. He followed her. quietly, harmlessly, for weeks. Found out where she worked, a data entry contractor at a legal firm. Found out her routine. Then he staged the meeting, accidentally bumping into her while visiting the same store again, laughing, apologizing, offering help. She recognized him from the therapy world. He'd given a seminar once. That opened the door. She asked for help. He declined officially, but offered coffee. That turned into conversations. Then dinners. Then a night where she admitted she couldn't trust anyone anymore. Carter told her it was okay. He could help her reset. This time the cabin wasn't needed. He'd renovated his basement, soundproof, cement-lined, pipe-drained. The plan was precision. The weapon was no longer a bag. He used vapor, chloroform, carefully measured, dabbed onto a cloth, sealed in a kiss. Melissa collapsed within seconds. He injected her with a muscle relaxant to keep her limp, then suffocated her using a sterile pillow weighted with river stones. It took 5 minutes. He timed it. Her body was placed in an acid drum he'd prepared months earlier, a barrel filled with potassium hydroxide and heating coils. The solution was slow but complete. Over 30 hours, Melissa disappeared into liquid. The remnants were filtered, dried, and flushed over a series of nights. Carter had evolved. He was invisible again. And yet, with evolution came oversight. Melissa's employer filed a missing report within 48 hours. Her friend mentioned a guy she'd been seeing. Security footage from the grocery store was pulled. Carter appeared twice. A data analyst at the legal firm connected a receipt Melissa had left in the break room with a timestamp that matched Carter's seminar, leading to an eventual name. Police visited again. This time, Carter's nerves didn't hold. His responses were curt, too prepared. A canine unit found traces of decomposition in his detached garage. Soil tests showed elevated alkali levels. The photos of Clara's burial sites were found on a flash drive labeled cabin renovation. He was arrested quietly, booked under charges of suspected homicide, with no bodies to present, but enough circumstantial evidence to hold him. At trial, his face was blank. He said nothing. 3 women gone, 0 confessions. But the jury didn't need words. The methods spoke for themselves. Carter Maddox was sentenced to life in Walla Walla State Penitentiary, where he currently spends 23 hours a day in a cell lined with silence, the only sound left being the whisper of everything he once erased. When Carter Maddox's face appeared on every major news outlet in 1994, the world saw not a monster, but a quiet, well-groomed man in tortoiseshell glasses who had once been praised for revolutionizing grief recovery. The contradiction chilled viewers. How could a man known for helping others grieve be the architect behind such methodical disappearances? In court, prosecutors dubbed him the cleanser, pointing to his clinical disposal tactics and lack of physical evidence. But the digital breadcrumbs, a flash drive, a deleted folder recovered from an old laptop, a journal with veiled entries, stitched together a picture of intentional erasure. 3 women were confirmed, but psychologists speculated there could be more, possibly up to 9, based on gaps in his appointment history and unexplained travel receipts. Carter refused all interviews, no confessions, no denials, just silence. Experts debated whether he was a narcissistic executioner or a high-functioning psychopath who saw death as therapy. What scared people most wasn't how he killed, it was how easily he blended in. No red flags, no childhood trauma, just a man who believed some people were better off gone. His trial lasted 11 days. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Life without parole. But the closure never truly came. Families of missing women, some never connected to the official case, began contacting detectives, believing their daughters might have crossed paths with Carter years ago. Some leads surfaced, but none stuck. And so, Carter remains where he is, Inmate 04588823, kept under high security, writing daily in notebooks no one is allowed to read. Every year, new FOIA requests are filed. Every year, they're denied. Because with men like Carter Maddox, the fear doesn't end with conviction. It lingers in the silence he left behind. Some killers crave chaos, others seek attention. But the next man didn't want either. He just wanted silence, total, permanent silence from the strangers who annoyed him most. And when their voices got too loud, he made sure they'd never speak again. Travis Eddington lived in a fading suburb outside Detroit, the kind of place where houses all looked the same, fences leaned with time, and neighbors judged you by the height of your grass. He was a maintenance worker by title, but in truth, he worked wherever he was needed. Air conditioning units, fuse boxes, broken locks, or leaking water lines. He kept his head down, wore gray uniforms without logos, and rarely spoke beyond the necessary. Travis didn't chase attention, he didn't get drunk, he didn't steal. But he watched, silently, carefully, for years. The people who annoyed him most weren't criminals. They were the ones who couldn't shut up. Loud voices through paper-thin walls, barking dogs left alone in yards, music thudding from garage bands 3 blocks away, couples screaming at 3 a.m. through cracked windows. Travis didn't understand how people could be so loud and selfish. They didn't know what it meant to respect quiet. And while others filed noise complaints or bought earplugs, Travis went further. He began cataloging them. Names, routines, addresses, times when the volume spiked, when they were most vulnerable. His first target was a man named Curtis, mid-30s, divorced, played music in his garage while drinking with friends on Saturday nights. Travis lived 2 doors down and could hear the bass through his bedroom wall. He started by pretending to help, offering to fix Curtis's fence for free, dropping by with old tools he claimed he no longer needed. He didn't talk much, just nodded, smiled faintly, and waited. After 2 weeks, Curtis saw him as just a quiet neighbor trying to be helpful. That's when Travis acted. He waited until the 3rd Saturday, when Curtis was home alone. The music was still playing, but no voices. Travis walked up the drive at 8:15 p.m., gloves already on, toolbox in hand. He knocked once, and Curtis answered, surprised. Travis told him he brought a replacement piece for the fence hinge. Curtis stepped outside to see. That's when Travis hit him, hard, fast, and silent. He used a ball-peen hammer, striking twice at the base of the skull. Curtis dropped without a sound. Travis dragged the body through the side gate into the backyard and covered it with a contractor's tarp. He waited an hour, turned off the garage speakers, and returned at midnight with his van. Curtis's body was rolled in an old carpet, zip-tied and loaded without neighbors noticing. Travis didn't panic. He drove 70 miles north to an unfinished cabin site his uncle had abandoned years ago. There, deep in the woods, he buried Curtis beneath a slab of concrete Travis had poured 2 weeks earlier, claiming he was re-flooring the storage shed. No one asked. Back home, he cleaned the hammer with muriatic acid, burned the tarp, and kept the gloves. Curtis was reported missing 3 days later, but no one suspected Travis. He had been seen helping a neighbor move patio stones that evening, and he'd kept the receipt from the gas station on his way home. Weeks passed. Police thought Curtis had left town, maybe relapsed, maybe fled child support. Travis just resumed his routine. But the silence on Saturday nights, that stayed. And that to him was worth everything. Travis Eddington's killings didn't start with rage. They started with routine, a pattern, a rhythm. He had grown obsessed with the morning walkways that lined the outer suburbs of Milwaukee. For weeks, he studied foot traffic, which runners wore headphones, who walked dogs, which houses had poor lighting or no cameras. He wasn't driven by revenge or lust. He was driven by opportunity and order. His first victim was a woman named Michelle Rowe, a nurse who took the same 5:15 a.m. route before her shift. Travis had watched her for 11 straight mornings from behind a low wall near a shuttered community center. On the 12th, he parked his father's old cargo van just out of sight, waiting with gloves, a long-handled flathead screwdriver, and a duffel bag filled with plastic sheeting. He approached from the shadows, footsteps buried beneath the wind. As she paused to adjust her shoelace near a bend in the path, Travis struck once, fast and low, targeting the kidney. She fell sideways into the mulch, stunned. No scream. He pulled the plastic around her body like he'd rehearsed and dragged her into the van in under 15 seconds. There were no tire marks, no cameras, no witnesses, and for 72 hours, no trace. Her body was eventually found along the shoreline of Lake Winnebago, stripped of clothing, hands bound, and stomach cavity filled with landscaping stones, an attempt to sink her that failed. The only clue was a faint imprint on her ankle, a triangle-shaped bruise that didn't match common tools. It was later linked to the end of a rare fencing mask grip Travis kept in his garage, something only 5 people in the state owned, one being him. But before police connected those dots, Travis killed again. This time, it was a jogger in Appleton. Again, early morning. Again, plastic wrap and fast exit. But this one fought back. She scratched him across the collarbone, breaking skin. What Travis didn't realize was that the woman had keys in her pocket that fell in the van during the struggle. He dumped her body in a ravine 2 counties away, but didn't notice the small bronze keychain wedged in the van's floor mat. Weeks later, a neighbor remembered seeing an old beige cargo van circling the block the same morning the second woman vanished. That tip led to a DMV trace. The van matched a vehicle registered under Travis's father's name. Police visited him under the guise of a routine vehicle check. Travis stayed calm, too calm, but when they asked to look inside the van, he refused. That refusal got them a warrant. Inside, they found faint blood traces under the bolts of the rear floor panel and a single keychain with the initials MR on it, Michelle Rowe. It was enough for an arrest. During questioning, Travis refused to speak, refused to deny. In his home were maps of jogging routes, a logbook of sunrise times, and toolkits with organized sections labeled by number, 1 to 10. Investigators believe he was preparing for more, possibly many more. The case was sealed when DNA from under the second victim's fingernails matched the scratch across his collarbone. At trial, he said nothing. No emotion, no reasoning. Just long eye contact with the victims' families and a quiet stare as the sentence was read. Life without parole. But in the minds of those who followed the case, one question remained. If he hadn't gotten scratched, if that one keychain hadn't dropped, how many more names would have ended up in that quiet little logbook beneath the maps in his basement? But just when investigators thought Travis Eddington's trail of cruelty had marked the darkest chapter, something colder emerged from the cornfields. Unlike Travis, who craved the spotlight, this next man operated in silence. No headlines, no mistakes, just bodies that vanished like dust in the wind. His name was Clyde Morvin Rice, and the harvest he left behind was anything but ordinary. Clyde Morvin Rice was a man no one ever truly noticed, and that's what made him perfect. A grain silo inspector for a private agricultural contractor in Nebraska, Clyde was the man who drove long stretches between remote farms, testing storage units, certifying safety conditions, and disappearing into the corn. He spoke softly, wore a sun-bleached cap, and always kept a clipboard in hand. He wasn't charming in the usual sense, but he had that grounded, easy tone that made rural families open their gates. Clyde targeted his victims carefully, young hitchhikers, runaways, or women working temporary harvest jobs, anyone who wouldn't be missed right away. He used job fairs and seasonal hiring sites near Lincoln and Grand Island, asking girls if they'd be willing to help monitor silo air pressure levels for quick cash. Once they agreed to a ride, Clyde's truck, a gray Dodge Ram with no license plates on the front, would roll quietly off the grid. Inside, the cabin was rigged with hidden locks and a false seat panel. Most victims were killed before sundown. Clyde's preferred method was asphyxiation, using a modified CO2 canister fitted with a farm hose and a steel clamp. He called it quiet time. He'd place the hose against the victim's mouth and nose, then pin her arms behind the seat with nylon feed straps. Death usually took less than a minute. He believed suffocation preserved silence, less mess, less panic. Afterward, Clyde would strip the body of all clothing and identifying features. He burned clothing in oil drums scattered across grain fields, then filed off dental enamel using a battery-powered Dremel. He kept trophies, not the traditional kind, but pieces of each girl's shoe soles, carved into perfect hexagons and arranged in a case like puzzle tiles. Disposal was surgical. Clyde used the empty silos, especially the ones tagged for decommission, lowering the bodies into the auger pit where they would break down under stored corn weight. But if he needed something faster, he buried them under fertilizer pits behind defunct grain elevators, covering the soil with lime and chicken manure to mask decomposition. He killed methodically for 9 years, and he never repeated a pattern, sometimes 1 kill per month, sometimes nothing for 8. Surveillance was nearly impossible. There were no traffic cameras in most areas he roamed, no paper trails, no survivors. But the first crack came when a farm dog uncovered a partially burned boot sole with a hexagonal pattern deep in a ravine. A local deputy remembered a silo inspection just days before. That led to Clyde's name, but there was no address on record. His contractor claimed he quit years ago. Police traced an old invoice to a storage unit outside Gibbon, where they found a walk-in freezer powered by a generator containing only one item: a woman's head sealed in resin. Her jaw had been polished smooth. Clyde had taken no photos, left no DNA. The only evidence was the way he disappeared the next day. His truck was found stripped in the Missouri River 6 weeks later. His body was never recovered. But in the glove box, sealed in duct tape, was a final puzzle piece: a hexagonal shoe sole stained in blood with the word "last" etched faintly into the rubber. Before he vanished, Clyde Rice left behind subtle clues that would haunt investigators for years. He was never a talker, but he did leave patterns hidden in the structure of his killings. Patterns no one saw at first. Each of the confirmed victims had worked near irrigation lines, in counties with active silo recalls, and every one of them vanished during the 3rd week of a month. He kept a tight radius of movement, never venturing more than 120 miles from Gibbon, but he shifted gears constantly, altering vehicle tags, changing his hair, even shaving his eyebrows to avoid sketch recognition. The one time he slipped was with his 11th victim, a waitress named Lisa Marin, last seen getting into a grain truck after her shift at a roadside diner. Her friend, who waited tables with her, remembered the logo on the truck: Mid-Harvest Inspection. Investigators traced the logo to a fake shell company tied to Clyde's name, but the website was hosted from a Tor address. That's when the FBI got involved. Clyde's freezer was shipped to Quantico, and the resin-preserved head was scanned and reconstructed. The victim was later identified through a serial number implanted in a dental crown, a rare procedure from a clinic in Phoenix. But even with that ID, Clyde remained a ghost. A search of the abandoned farmhouse he once squatted in revealed only cryptic receipts: livestock feed, grain molds, silicone gloves, burner phones, but no journals, no maps, no manifestos. And then the discoveries began. A silo 12 miles west of Ord was drained during a land repurposing initiative. In the dry bottom, bone fragments, shreds of nylon, and a rusted CO2 tank. A second silo near Broken Bow yielded 4 human femurs during a methane leak investigation. Suddenly, counties across Nebraska were reopening forgotten silo sites, and the body count rose to 18, though some agents believed it was closer to 30. Clyde had vanished, but his story wasn't over. One night in 2016, nearly a decade after his last confirmed kill, a letter arrived at the Hall County Sheriff's Department. No return address. Inside was a single Polaroid, grainy and color-faded, showing a woman in work boots standing beside a corn silo. In the bottom right corner, written in ballpoint, she was number 1. You just didn't know it. The sheriff recognized the woman immediately. She'd gone missing in 1998. That meant Clyde had started 2 years earlier than anyone thought. But that wasn't the worst part. The photo was fresh. The woman in it hadn't aged a day. The theory? Clyde had taken photos before killing each victim and preserved them, waiting for the right time to send them, years later, to make his presence felt again. To this day, every January, a Polaroid arrives at the department. Always a different girl, always a different silo. But the message is always the same: still watching. Whether Clyde Rice is alive or dead, no one knows. But the fields remember, and somewhere the harvester walks. That was the 5th, the last. Each one more ruthless than the one before. 5 killers, 5 different faces of evil. Some vanished, some were caught. All left bodies behind. What they had in common wasn't how they killed, but how long they got away with it. And maybe the scariest part? They never looked like monsters. They looked like neighbors, co-workers, strangers you pass without a second glance. Keep your doors locked, keep your eyes open, because killers like these don't always stay buried.